Have to introduce the persons here at the head table, but I will. To my far left is our spokesman on national security and party chairman Fitz Jackson. Beside him, our spokesman on industry and commerce, Peter Bunting, our party leader and opposition leader, Dr. Peter Phillips, our spokesperson on justice, Senator Donna Scott Motley, our spokesperson on energy, and House Leader Philip Powell, and I'm Julian Robinson, the General Secretary. The opposition leader will make a statement, and Mr. Bunting will also do a presentation, and then we'll take questions after that. All right?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the media and others. Last Tuesday in the House, the issue came up of the extension of the states of emergency that had been declared in St. James, St. Catherine, and parts of the corporate area, as well as the issue of the extension of the zones of special operation in Mount Salem and in Denham Town. I think it needs to be pointed out that we supported the extension of the zones of special operations, but we did not vote in favor of the extension of the states of public emergency. And this has generated a great deal of public discussion and interest that we would like at least to help clarify some of the issues that have arisen. There were three central questions that were raised, certainly by myself and by other members of the opposition. First of all is the question that has been posed, namely, will the end of the state of emergency mean that none of the security measures that are now in place in St. James and St. Catherine can remain? And the answer definitively is that 99.9% of all the measures now in place as far as crime fighting is concerned can continue despite the ending of the state of emergency. Not one police officer has to be removed from St. James or St. Catherine North or corporate area. Not one military officer has to be removed. Not one checkpoint has to be ended. Not one public gathering which they would not want to take place would have to take place. All the powers that exist. In fact, they can add to the numbers of persons in place. It is the only thing that they have been doing that they would not be able to do is to detain persons in the long term and deny them access to the courts of the land. Let me make it clear on this last point. Police still have the power to detain anyone who they think has committed a crime or is about to engage in some unlawful exercise. But if they do it after a week or so, they would be obliged to grant that person access to a court of law. And it is usually the case that if they can present to the court that they have a justifiable reason for wanting to detain such a person, courts have been historically minded to grant them that power to detain. But you cannot, outside of the circumstances of a state of emergency, simply lock up somebody and keep them for as long as you want. So that's one point that has been made. A second issue that we raised in the debates, particularly raised by our spokesman on national security and Member of Parliament for South St. Catherine, Mr. Jackson, is the question of the detainees and the treatment of the detainees and the rights of the detainees. And the fact is that you have had lots of persons detained, close to 3,700 in the case of St. James.
That was up to October.
Up to October.
9th.
And less than 4% have been charged for any offense. The numbers in St. Catherine are even more disproportionate. In St. Catherine, close to 6,000 persons have been detained, and the number charged is less than 1% in the case of St. Catherine. Now, of those persons detained, only 18 up to last week have been allowed to have a hearing before the tribunal that was set up. 18. And the number in North St. Catherine is 0. Nobody of the 6,000, 5,000 plus, none of them have had the opportunity to be heard before a tribunal. And we consider this to be a denial of basic human rights. Now, there are some people who say this is not an important issue for them and that there have been no undue detentions. In fact, a case was made to that point by the Prime Minister. We disagree. And in fact, as Jamaicans for Justice have pointed out in their own statement, is that this is a denial of the basic fundamental rights of the citizens in these communities to have access to a tribunal that could hear their case. In fact, I don't think any detention orders have been issued at all in the case of St. Catherine for the persons who have been detained. The problem here, as we sought to make clear, is that these 9,000 plus people who have been denied are persons who are going to leave the experience of the state of emergency with a grievance against the state. And therefore you are perpetuating a cycle whereby there is this continued wedge between citizen and the state, and this wedge between the citizens and the security forces, which is ultimately counterproductive to long-term crime control. That was the second major issue which we put. The third issue which arose, simply put, and there is the question of the legality of the further extension of states of emergency. And the point has been raised by eminent counsel, both in public, in the media, and we have sought legal advice. Simply put, a state of emergency to be declared has to meet a very high bar, namely that there is a fundamental threat to the safety and security of the state and the security by persons or by a person or persons, such as to threaten the basic functioning, my paraphrase, of the state. it may be arguable that such a threat existed at the beginning in St. James or any one of the areas. But it cannot be argued that that level of threat still remains in the areas. And there are those that say that the present construction of the Constitution says that the denial of rights, such as I described before, to the detainees in St. Catherine and St. James and elsewhere, really is not justifiable is not demonstrably justifiable in a free and democratic society. We have to remember that the original law giving rise to states of emergency and their declaration preceded the Charter of Rights. And the Charter of Rights, which was passed in 2011, says that you can't take away any citizen's rights on any basis other than that which would be demonstrably justifiable in a free and democratic society. So the view has been advanced to us, and we have been persuaded that further extensions on this basis that are being sought are in fact unconstitutional. Now, there's a simple point. You cannot seek to uphold the law by breaking the law. We can't ask citizens to adhere to lawful behavior if the state itself departs from lawful behavior. So I think, and there's a further point which I think was summarized eloquently by former Chief of Staff and former Commissioner of Police Hartley Lewin in an article published in the newspaper in January. And I quote him. He says, "A state of emergency is the ultimate tool in the law enforcer's toolbox. When taken from its box, it must be used for the shortest time possible and must be the first step in a bigger overall plan. It is supposed to signal that when declared, things are serious and it cannot be business as usual." We have said that a state of emergency was never contemplated by our Constitution to be a routine crime-fighting measure. And indeed, to make that point, all the crime-fighting measures that are underway, except unlimited detention, can be pursued without a state of emergency having to be declared. There is a fourth point that was raised particularly by Mr. Bunting in the House in his presentation, and that is the question as to whether the state of emergency having been declared is an effective long-term crime-fighting tool. And he pointed to the data for this year, that in the areas where a state of emergency was declared and in the rest of the country. I'm going to ask him to present that data. But the overall point I want to make is that we in the People's National Party remain committed to support any lawful crime-fighting measures. We indicated to the private sector organization of Jamaica when they requested earlier this year our willingness to participate in a crime summit. We have given support to the government in the passage of the laws like the Zozo legislation. We called for the review of the anti-gang legislation. We have supported, in fact, we called for more money to be put in the budget for policing. We called for, and I want to call it again, for the police to be paid more, for them to be taken out of the line in the public sector wage negotiations and given reasonable awards, because quite frankly they have been very valuable and offered invaluable service to the people of Jamaica over the period. But we must never forget the ultimate responsibility for developing an effective plan belongs to the government. We have called for this plan. The Constitution places a particular responsibility, for good reason, on the Parliament for the declaration of a state of emergency. A state of emergency is not a crime plan. So I'm going to ask Mr. Bunting to just make his presentation here.
All right, thank you. The narrative that has been pushed by the Prime Minister and other government ministers is that in a recent history, the only successful crime-fighting tool or strategy has been the use of the state of emergency. And I'm going to show some slides this morning which suggest that that is not so. The first is a slide that I used in Parliament. And this, in a sense, addresses one of the earlier points that the opposition leader made. And it shows that this year, these are the figures for 2018, murders on a per 100,000 basis in Jamaica. And what you will see to the extreme right, that bar shows for all Jamaica, we are having 48 murders per 100,000 population. And that's typically in the international journals for comparability, you express a murder rate on a per 100,000 basis. And what you will see there is that to the extreme right is the average for Jamaica is 48. The average for St. James now is 55. That's the average for the entire year, 55 murders per 100,000. But we see now in the middle, I don't know if you can get in the middle, Westmoreland, I don't know if you can get that prompt out of the middle of the slide.
Go back to it. Yeah.
Okay. In the middle, Hanover and Westmoreland, you will see they're at 96 per 100,000 for Westmoreland and 82 for Hanover. So what it shows now is that we're focusing on St. James at 55 per 100,000 and St. Catherine with 38 per 100,000, below the national average with these states of emergency, when Westmoreland and Hanover, which are twice in some cases, the murder rate of these parishes is not getting the same sort of treatment. But another measure of effectiveness of police activity, and I think we're having, go ahead, is arrests. You know, how many people are you really taking off the road, criminals off the road and getting before the courts? And what we see that this year, with all of this extra activity, arrests are actually down from 13,600 to 12,700, down by almost 1,000. But what is even more important is the statistic called arrests with evidence. Because in the case of arresting somebody with evidence, it means you held them with a firearm or ammunition, or you held them with drugs, or you held them with stolen property. So the only weakness in this case is the police officer. So you're likely to get a much higher conviction rate. And we see arrests with evidence fell from 3,000, just under 3,900 last year to 3,100 this year. Now these are non-crime fatality statistics that are used as additional measures of the effectiveness of your policing. I want to go to a third slide. That one looks at firearms recovered. In 2017, the JCF and the JDF recovered 825 weapons. This year, they've only recovered 694. Similarly, with ammunition, Last year, 21,500 rounds of ammunition were recovered. This year, 10,786, almost half of what was recovered the previous year. Now, the other issue is murder statistics, or what I started off with, where I said that the only effective strategy in recent times has been to look at using the state of emergency. Now, this graph shows the trend in increases in murders over 40 years, over 50 years almost, from 1972 up to 2018. But I want to drill down to the last 7 or 8 years. Go to the next slide, please. Now what we see here is 2009. This graph, the points start at 2009, which was the all-time high, 1,692. In 2010, you had the Tivoli operation, which really reset the levels. The new normal, so to speak, would have been a range of 1,100 plus or minus 10%. For the next 5 years after the Tivoli operation, the range of murders stayed in that band, 1,100 plus or minus 10%. It was since 2016 that the number of murders broke out of that band and spiked again to 1,600. Now this year, 2018, and that's the last point on the right, even with 3 states of emergency and 2 ZOSOs, we will end the year at about 1,300 murders. We have already exceeded the total murders for any year in that band, that 2011 to 2015 period. We have already exceeded that. In those 5 years, 2011 to 2015, there was no state of emergency. We went as low as 1,005, and we never exceeded 1,207. This year, we have already exceeded 1,207. We were 1,216 as at last Saturday. So it shows you, even with all this, we're still going to end up about 100 murders more this year than in any of the 5 years, the highest of the 5 years after the 2010 Tivoli operation. Now, I want you to look at some of the reductions. And clearly, the reduction in St. James has been very dramatic. And this is why we support it, because St. James was out of control at the start of the year. So we've seen just about a 70% reduction, 69.9% in St. James. But you go to St. Catherine North, which has a state of emergency since March 2018. There you see a more modest reduction, 26.6%. But in Kingston Central, where there's been no state of emergency, we have a 44% reduction. In Manchester, with no state of emergency, and in fact, we have given up resources. 4 days a week, we've given up a fighting patrol to go to Mobay to support their activity. An inspector by 7 plus a 4x4 pickup. We have still showed a 36% reduction using less resources than normal. In St. Anne, 26% reduction. In Clarendon, 21% reduction. In St. Elizabeth, 19% reduction. So what we're seeing here is that significant double-digit reductions in police divisions where we have no state of emergency, and in fact, which have been operating with less resources. And finally, what I want to show in this line graph is a month-by-month depiction of the number of murders. So you see in January, you had somewhere over 140 or about 140 murders in January. State of emergency announced January in St. James, March in St. Catherine. And what we see is a short-term significant decline from about 140 to about 90 something. But since June, when we had that 90 something, what we're seeing is a plateau. In fact, if anything, there's a slight upward trend in terms of the number of murders per month. Nationally. These are the figures for entire Jamaica. So you know, from parish to parish, police division to police division, you'll find fluctuations. But as a national crime strategy, the effectiveness of the state of emergencies ended in June. It's having no further impact. And the steady state level we're at now, again, is still higher than the average of any of the years between 2011 and 2015. Any of those 5 years where there was no state of emergency operating. So I really wanted to use this to illustrate that this argument that the only strategy that works long term is a state of emergency is not supported by the data made available from the JCF.
Okay, thank you very much.
And just to emphasize the point,
Yeah.
You hear the Prime Minister, particularly in the debate in the House on Tuesday, keep on referring to the 21% reduction. The point made by the graph is that that is 21% reduction is not a continuing reduction. And he uses the 21% to give the impression as if it's a continuing reduction. As was indicated in the graph, it basically finished from May. You have a sudden further drip in June, but from May, the reduction from the state of emergency came to an end virtually. It has plateaued from then.
So I think I want to thank Mr. Bunting, Mr. Jackson. There's a summary point that I will end on. Our decision was not lightly arrived at. It was based upon very careful consideration of all the issues that we had to consider. It involved an assessment of our constitutional responsibilities regarding the rights of citizens.
All citizens.
It involved also a consideration of the effectiveness of crime-fighting strategies. And I want to emphasize that the vote that we took does not have to result in any drawdown of forces in any of the areas affected. Although what we are saying is that there can be a more effective national strategy to be followed. I think it's important to note that an easy course, given the degree of public misunderstanding, an easy course would be, and an expedient course politically, would be just to vote in favor, despite the 9,000 plus people who are being detained, despite all the numbers that we are seeing there. The easy course is, look, don't step in the answerness. It's going to generate all kinds of confusion. There's a political price. I have said that as a party, as an opposition, as a responsible opposition, we have to stand by principle and by law and by our best judgments as to what is best for the country. We didn't do this lightly. It was after careful consideration and consultation. We went and Mr. Jackson led a team along with Senator Scott Motley, went and consulted with people in St. James, with the families, with their lawyers. We spoke in the internal and external affairs with the public defender and other officials. It is after careful consideration. The trampling of the rights of Jamaicans cannot be justified, whether they are detainees or just ordinary citizens. We believe that we can be safe and that a government can guarantee the safety of its citizens without having to simply resort to a state of emergency, and that especially one that might not be lawful. Thank you very much. We are now available for your questions.
Let's identify yourself and the media house you represent.
I have a question, Dr. Phillips. As you have
Just introduce yourself.
Siobhan Campbell, Nationwide News. And you've most likely heard from quite a few people across the country, including the Montego Bay Chamber of Commerce. They are quite hoping that the measures can continue. In the case of the MCC, they wanted to go on for at least another 6 months in the parish. Is there anything possible that the government can do to convince you to change your mind regarding the continuation?
The answer to their question, can the measures continue? Yes. There's nothing that we have done that would stop the measures. The only thing that could not be done is the long-term detention of citizens without giving them access to the courts. Everything else can continue. So the short answer is yes, the measures can continue.
The Prime Minister gave statistics that said at this point there are only 20 persons being detained under the state of emergency in St. James. So I want you to consider, is it worth suspending the rights for the approximately 200,000 people that live in St. James to keep those 20 detained on an ongoing basis? I don't think so.
So under no circumstances will you support another?
No, but
But I think you're missing the point, respectfully. Because the point is, what is the element which is in the state of emergency which does not exist under ordinary laws? And the only element, and I beg you, consider it, because the fact that you have asked that question several times suggests to me that perhaps in all of this you have not focused on it. The only element which is brought in under the state of emergency is the arbitrary detention. The Attorney General herself, in the debate in the Parliament, made it clear that the advantage is that the laws were in one place. Now,
For
administrative purposes. But the laws exist. If you stop for a moment and you look at the Jamaica Constabulary Force Act, you will see they have the right to cordon, the right to curfew, the right to detain, the right to search, the right to set up roadblocks. So what we are doing when we vote against the state of emergency is we are saying, please, Montego Bay, I know you don't want 4,000 young people to be scraped up and put in jail. That's the only element that has been removed. So everything remains. And I have taken the time to ask everybody who supports the state of emergency, what do you like about it? And they say, we like the whole heap of police and soldiers. We like that. It makes us feel safe. The government can continue to do that to make their people feel safe. And if murder goes up in St. James, the government has to take responsibility, because it would mean that their crime-fighting strategies have failed. Please, Siobhan.
Dr. Phillips.
yes, sir.
Just a sort of follow-up on Siobhan's question. You don't want to belabor the point. But there seems to be a perception, though, I accept this. I have heard your remarks extensively, and I've heard all the remarks that have been made regarding this issue. But in my mind, there appear to be a perception on the part of some stakeholders, critical stakeholders, as well as the ordinary resident in Canterbury or wherever, any one of those volatile areas in St. James. There seems to be a perception that under a state of emergency, that things will remain calm, that there will be significantly less murders, and that they'll be able to live a more peaceful life, at least for now. I know it cannot continue in perpetuity. If in fact, I just heard you about the increase in the murders and the government will have to take responsibility, but if there is a general perception from the population that you erred in the decision that you made on Tuesday, will you be willing to face the voters and pay that political price?
Well, as I said before you asked the question, we didn't arrive at it, at our decision, lightly. We are aware of all the political risks that are involved. But there comes a time when you need to do the right thing, the lawful thing, the constitutionally approved thing, rather than simply act in pursuit of political expediency. So we have taken the decision. We didn't take it lightly, but we took it after careful consideration and consultation. We even reviewed when the Prime Minister asked us to reconsider our situation in the Parliament. We withdrew, if you saw. We considered it again, and we took the decision because we believe that all things considered, the right to the fact that no troops or police personnel have to be reduced, that nothing in the normal toolbox of crime fighting measures has to stop, the fact that the results and the effectiveness is as you have seen. When we took all of that into account, we think we did the right thing by the citizens of the country. Now, to come to your point, there is a general misconception, an illusion, if you will, that state of emergency or the ending of the state of emergency mean that all the police have to pack up all the equipment and send them back to Harman barracks in town or Up Park camp. It is not true. Nothing has to change, except that if you detain someone and you want to keep them for over a week, you have to go to the courts and explain why. Right? In fact, that provision of being heard by a tribunal separate from the court was made in the regulations. But in practice, the citizens have not been able to get access to this tribunal. Why? Because the detention orders that are required are not being signed.
They must be signed by the
Jamaica has to learn that if we want a different future from the one that we have had, from the experience that we have had in the past, we are going to have to start to respect the rights of every single citizen. And the rights of poor citizens are not any less than the rights of well-to-do citizens. The rights of the youths are not any less than the rights of older people. If we keep sowing the seeds of disrespect for people's rights, we are going to find that they will disrespect the rights of the rest of the society. So I believe on this matter, the Prime Minister says he's for the respect of people's rights and a different kind of policing. We also are for that. We ought to be able to find common ground. But I think it's important to understand that government has its responsibilities and an opposition has its responsibilities as provided for in the Constitution. It is for a particular reason, that's as Lloyd Barnett pointed out in his article. The opposition is supposed to be, in the construct of the law, the opposition is supposed to be the first line of protection for the rights of citizens. And we believe, despite that it may be politically inconvenient, we believe we must exercise that responsibility in the proper way.
We should make a comment on that point you raised about political price. Phillips has said, when it comes to protecting the interests of the country, the opposition has a responsibility to make the right decision, regardless of what political price to pay. Dr. Phillips has not said it, but you will recall that some time ago, while he was Minister of National Security and had to take certain decisions in the interest of the country's security, he took those decisions at his own internal political risk. We remember the burning of his T-shirts in Spanish Town. Remember the writing up of his names all over Kingston when he had to take the decision as Minister of National Security to protect the interests of not just some Jamaicans, but all Jamaicans. It is a consistency in that commitment to all of Jamaica that has informed the decision of the party that he leads at this time.
A quick follow-up. Dr. Phillips, I'm not sure if an attempt was made by the government and the opposition through its avenue of veil royal talks to discuss this issue. But if there was no meeting between the government and the opposition regarding a very important issue such as this, would you accept that both the government and the opposition should take some responsibility for not meeting in that space that has been established by both sides to deal with national issues, to try to reach some compromise on this matter?
Well, we have had no request to meet, so I can't meet with myself. All right? I indicated earlier that in the course of the year, the private sector organization of Jamaica had requested of us whether we would be willing to meet as part of what came to be known as a crime summit, along with government and other stakeholders. We have said, yes, we're willing. And we always remain willing. One of the strange things about this whole saga is that the only time the issues arise, despite all the questions that we have asked, can we know what your end game is? Can we see what would be the measures that would allow us to bring this to an end? Can we have an idea of what is the medium-term strategy that would restore the rights of people? We have had no request in the periods between the extension and the next extension. We have had no outreach, no discussion, no attempt to meet. I want to reiterate, if the government is of the view that it is their business to define the policy to be followed, we agree. It is their responsibility, and they bear that price. But where we are called upon by the Constitution, with good reason, to exercise our decisions regarding the protection of citizens' rights, we are going to do it. That is a separate question from the question of defining policy. In the past, this same party, which now forms the government, called upon the government and said they didn't want to be part of any dialogue. We would be part of a dialogue if there is a desire to have a dialogue, but the responsibility for basic definition of policy in this matter remains that of the government. It's not a shared responsibility. Our responsibility is in the parliament that was given to us by the Constitution for a particular reason. And the reason for doing that was because the framers of the Constitution and the Charter of Rights wanted to ensure that this power to take away people's rights was not going to be done willy-nilly or arbitrarily. This notion that is two of us running the country one time is not a valid notion.
I want to make the point.
If I could just add something to
Yeah.
this. I've seen NGOs making comments that they're condemning both sides for not agreeing on a crime plan. There are three branches of government: the executive, the legislature, and the courts. The opposition only participates in parliament. We are not part of the executive. Our responsibility under the Constitution is to be a safeguard and to provide oversight to the executive. But it is the responsibility of the executive to come up with that crime plan, not for us to agree on something and jointly come up. They campaigned in 2015, and if you go back to your publication, you will see an article with Derek Smith, then opposition spokesman, saying we have a crime plan. That was in 2015. We're at the end of 2018, and the only plan that we have seen is this use of states of emergency. A state of emergency is not a crime-fighting tool. A state of emergency is not a crime-fighting strategy. If you read Section 20 of the Constitution as it applies to calling a state of emergency under these circumstances, it really speaks to the state being under threat, such as was evident in 2010. That is the sort of armed insurrection, or certainly a coordinated action by a group or groups to threaten the state. And those circumstances do not anywhere near exist today in St. James, and in fact nowhere in Jamaica. So we would quite frankly be acting unconstitutionally if we buckled to whatever public pressure or governmental pressure is being put on us, and that cannot be a legitimate option for an opposition.
I want to comment about the further to the leader of the opposition's response to the question of cooperation on the part of the government. You will recall that the Prime Minister announced that the opposition was invited to sit on the National Security Council, and I was the designated representative as spokesperson for national security for the opposition. I want to make it clear, at none of the meetings that I have been invited, any discussion ever take place about matters of security and any policy issues, sensitive issues for which the opposition's opinion was requested. I want to make that abundantly clear. My invitation and acceptance of the invitation on behalf of the opposition to sit on the National Security Council has never afforded the opportunity to discuss any of the issues pertinent to the calling or the necessity for a state of emergency. Any discussion that has taken place there is what has been announced publicly by the government. And I also want to make a second point, because during the debate on Tuesday, the Prime Minister went at length, and much of the government's operatives, to give the impression to the public that we, by not voting to extend the state of emergency, are giving comfort to criminal activities. Personally speaking, I found that those comments unfortunate and regrettable, coming from a team of members who in 2010 went to length to frustrate the process of detention of an individual that is now behind bars, confess to criminal activities. And the chart that was placed up there showed clearly what happened post 2010 in terms of the crime reduction. So frankly speaking, personally, they don't have the moral authority to make that unjust, unsubstantiated claim against this opposition.
Good point.
just a follow-up question regarding the crime plan. The Prime Minister has stated on numerous occasions now that the plan exists, but it is not something that he would like to release to the public. Do you first half, you accept that statement? And my second statement, as the alternative government that the people would be looking to in an election if they're unsatisfied with the current administration, why does not the PNP put forward its own?
Look, let me say this. The leader of the opposition made the point earlier on. There's one government at a time. Do you want the opposition to govern now? Do you want us to institute? Do you want us to institute a crime plan now? If you
administration, so you should be able to put towards
no. Listen, let me respond. If you want the opposition to govern now with a crime plan, say so.
I think it is worth pointing out. You know, let's not deal with this. We have a serious problem in the country. If the Prime Minister wants to mobilize public support around a strategy and a plan, the only way to do it is to present the plan. He can present it privately. He can present it publicly. He can present parts of it publicly and say there are private parts of it that are sensitive ones that I don't want to speak to. But it is the responsibility to present an overall plan. You cannot ask people to go to the parliament, take away people's rights now, and say, trust me, I have a plan. That would not be a responsible approach on the part of any parliamentarian to simply go on trust. We have, in the interest of collaboration, when it was declared, we supported it. Because we thought, quite frankly, that the situation constituted a threat to the survival of a substantial part of our community, the tourism industry, and with all its ramifications. We asked for further and better particulars once, twice, 3 times. At some point, when it's not forthcoming, you have to take some action because we have a responsibility to the country and to the citizens of the country. It's not a parlor game of Tweedledee and Tweedledum. You show me yours, I show you mine. That's not what we are about. We have the interests and the rights of the Jamaican people that must be foremost in our mind. Regarding our plan, I would simply say this. You saw the graph. We were able to sustain numbers in the band of 1,000, 1,100, much lower than it is now.
And with much fewer resources.
And with fewer resources, right? So we have done it before, we can do it again. You take that on trust, and when the time comes, we'll tell you how.
And look, we have both been ministers of national security. There is really very little, maybe 5% of what you're doing in a crime plan that can't be discussed with the opposition. In fact, almost everything could be discussed. Sources and methods of gathering intelligence are what you will retain. You don't put that out in the public. But there's almost nothing else. And operational details which are not the purview of government in any way. That's the Commissioner of Police given sole responsibility for the operational superintendent. So that's a different side. But taking that out, outside of perhaps some multinational agreements you have to assist you technically and the sources and methods that you will use, there's really nothing else that has to be kept secret from an opposition or from the public.
All right, thank you very much.